how would you say Jesus presented himself in the Gospels, in history? I mean, did Jesus, what
Jesus
was his
was,
message? What was his message? Yeah, what was his message? Yeah.
well, again, there's not an answer. There's not a simple answer to that. From a
Mhm.
historical point of view,
Yes.
Jesus was a an apocalyptic Jewish prophet.
Maybe you can define for the viewers what do you mean by apocalyptic? Yeah.
Jesus thought the world was coming to an end very soon, and that the kingdom of God would be built upon this earth by super.
So you derive this understanding from the historical text itself?
Yes, from the
Mm,
Gospels and
okay,
Paul.
I see. Understood. All right. So would you say that Paul is a reliable source, by the way?
Well, Paul didn't know Jesus
Mhm.
personally. Gospels can be presenting a picture of Jesus, but when were the Gospels written? The Gospels were written in the Mark was the first one in the year 70.
Yes.
Mark and Matthew and Luke may have been written around the year 80.
Mhm,
We're guessing. The
mhm,
Gospel of John could have been written around the year 90 or 100.
mhm, mhm. My record says 90, but I'm not sure. Mm,
But, that was still
mhm,
20, 40, 50 years after the death of Jesus.
I see.
So why would anybody expect the Gospels to correctly reflect everything about the historical Jesus?
But I think there will be a lot of Christians who would disagree with you with with your statement here because they will.
Sure, of course, but they're
Yeah,
not
yeah,
they're
yeah.
not Christians who've studied this.
Mm,
They're
mm,
not Christians who studied this from a
mm,
historical or scientific point of view. Because of course, just because somebody can say Jesus looked like a zealot,
mm, mm.
well, yes, of course he looked like a zealot. You
So,
if you portray him a certain way, does that mean he
mm,
didn't exist? Well, what are you saying, that zealots didn't exist?
mm,
Of
mm,
course,
mm,
zealots
mm,
existed. And of course, you can see Jesus as a zealot, or you can see him as a prophet, or you
mhm,
can see him as an apocalypticist, or you can
mm,
see him as a follower of John the Baptist.
mm. Would you say that he's all of the above and more? Would you, as a
Yes,
Christian? Yeah, as a
yes,
Christian,
he's all of the above.
it's all of the above. I would say, yeah, because
Yes,
I think it's a more reasonable thing to say that instead of just applying Jesus to one particular role, right?
absolutely. That's
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
absolutely. You
yeah,
could
yeah.
you could have seen Jesus in the first century as occupying a lot of different roles, social
Mm,
roles, that
mm,
were completely available at the time.
I
In
see.
fact, that's what historians are supposed to do. We're
Mhm,
supposed to say, look at this guy who probably was born in um, Nazareth. He probably grew up in Galilee.
yes.
He probably came at some point to be a disciple of John the Baptist, and he
Mhm,
was baptized by John the Baptist.
okay.
And then at some point, he and John the Baptist came to a disagreement. This is what I think.
This is not in the gospel text, though. Why do you say that there's a disagreement between him and John?
Because Jesus started off as a follower of John and didn't continue as a follower of John.
Oh, you're talking about the baptism at the River Jordan, right?
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
but also John was an ascetic.
Mm-hmm.
He taught the avoidance of eating meat, for example, and
Mm-hmm.
drinking wine.
I see. I see.
And
Speaking
Jesus,
of, yeah, speaking of John, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with the Mandaic religion, right?
yeah,
So, do you know what they say about Jesus?
I think they just say he was a prophet at some point, don't they?
No, they don't. They don't. They actually say that he's a heretic of some sort. Yeah,
Oh yeah,
yeah,
I wouldn't
yeah,
be surprised.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But Jesus became famous for drinking wine
Mm-hmm.
and eating a lot of food.
I see. I see. Okay.
It's right there in the Gospels. Why would they
Yes.
invent
Yes.
this?
It is. It is. So, you would say that John disagrees with this practice.
I would say that Jesus left the John movement when he
Mm-hmm.
disagreed with John,
I see. I see.
and Jesus started his own movement,
Mm-hmm. I see. I
which
see.
advocated drinking wine, eating meat, and hanging around with whores.
Wow, that's putting it quite bluntly.
Well, that's what he was accused of,
Okay. All right. All right. Okay.
and he never denied it.
Okay. All right. All right. Okay. Mm-hmm.
So Jesus hung around with prostitutes. He drank wine. He ate meat.
Mm-hmm.
All the kind of stuff that John the Baptist didn't like.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But there's no indication in the Gospels that John disapproved of this. Mm.
Well, that's kind of what you mean by indication.
Mm-hmm.
John never becomes a follower of Jesus,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's true. That's true. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and I think
Okay.
that I think Jesus started off as a disciple of John and then parted company with him.
I see. Speaking about John the Baptist, right? I do have this question. Why do you think that the gospel author wrote about John in the beginning of his gospel, but in fact, they mention part of his mission for John proclaiming, in the wilderness, proclaiming the coming of the Messiah of Jesus, right? And then suddenly he just got written out of the story. Is there a reason behind it? Do you think?
Well, because John was not a follower of Jesus in the end.
But
I think it's true. I think it's true
mm.
that Jesus was a disciple of John, and
Okay,
the gospel writers wanted to emphasize that,
I see.
but
Okay,
they
yeah,
didn't
because-
want to. They didn't want to emphasize that John rejected Jesus.
There's no mention of that actually, right?
Exactly.
So I don't think we have any historical documents of John the Baptist. Do we have that? Anything about his mission? I mean, apart from the Mandaic text, obviously.
I think apart from the Mandean text, there's probably nothing. I don't remember.
Yeah, I don't think there's any, right? I mean, and the Gospels mention him very little. There's not much at all about John.
Yeah, they didn't want to mention him much, but I think it's amazing they mention him at all.
Okay.
And I think the reason they do mention him is because it was a historical fact they couldn't deny.
Yes. Okay. I see. Interesting.
People knew that Jesus was a disciple of John.
So I guess it must be a widespread knowledge that Jesus was associated with John, so they couldn't write it out, so they had to mention him. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah. And but they left John in, and that's why they whitewashed it all, but by saying that, when Jesus comes to John to be baptized, John says, "Oh, I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy."
Yeah. Yes.
Well, that's not historical.
I see. Okay, interesting viewpoint you have there of John. Yeah, I've never thought about asking you about John, but since you brought up the subject, it's very interesting. Yeah.
No, John the Baptist was a historical character. We actually know more about John the Baptist, from Josephus, than we do about Jesus.